Hello everyone. We're going to try this again. I think I've tried this about 4 times this weekend, so we're going to do something a little different here and see if this video can work. This week we have one chapter. We're going to be doing chapter 4, and so there'll be one discussion board. Initial post definitely by Wednesday night. You do have the interview summary that hopefully you all have been working on, or at least have it scheduled to do, and we'll talk about it. And then you should be starting on your DI collection with ID this week, so we'll talk about that also. Let's go ahead and go into the slides and see how they look. So the first 3 or 4 slides are totally some quiz questions that other students have had some issues with. So I went ahead and put those in here just for your information. Most of them have the page numbers on it that you'll be wanting to find. So just left them on there so you all could look ahead and review those specifically. The quiz objectives. There are 3. I'm trying to get everything kind of set up here. First of all, there's 3 criteria necessary to qualify for special education services under the IDEA category of intellectual disabilities. We'll talk about that. Identify widely used instruments for assessing intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and state important issues to consider when interpreting using the results of such tests. Describe common characteristics of students with intellectual disabilities and explain how these characteristics are relevant to planning and delivering instructions. We'll also talk about identifying factors that might account for the wide differences in the prevalence of intellectual disabilities within the school-age population across state and also across school districts. Different states have a little bit different rules. They follow the federal guidelines, but they may have something just a tad bit different. So have to watch that. Describe key elements of instruction for teaching academic, functional, and self-determination skills to students with intellectual disabilities. Above all, challenge them. Do not try to make it easy for them, because it will not be good in the end as they get into adult life and possible post-secondary options that they're starting to have for students with ID. Also identify factors that should guide planning and placement decisions for individuals with intellectual disabilities. We'll talk about that. What I want you to start out next is I want you to pause the video. I know we just got started. Pause the video and click the Teaching Students with Cognitive Impairments and go ahead and look at that, and then come back to the video. I'll let you go. All right. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of a better idea of what it's like for teaching students with ID. We're going to go right into IDE definition. And so the 3 criteria for a diagnosis: significant sub-average intellectual functioning is a score of 2 or more standard deviations below the mean on a standardized intelligence test. And we'll look at those scores here in a second. But those are very critical just to get started for eligibility for IDEA definition. An individual must also have significant difficulty with tasks of everyday living or adaptive behavior. So you're looking at those everyday skills that typical students and children will learn from home as they're growing up. It might be the typical chores around the house, the getting ready, the dressing, the tying shoes, those self-help skills, things like that. The deficits must occur during the developmental period to distinguish intellectual disabilities from other disabilities. So it must also occur during that developmental period. Then there's also the AAIDD definition. Theirs is a little bit different. And intellectual disability is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior. So those parts look very similar. And in adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical academic skills. This disability originates before age 18. So you can see there's a difference in age. The IDEA definition is going to be looking at during that developmental period, and the AAIDD definition breaks it down to where they could have it before age 18. So there's a definite age difference in there to remember. They also have 5 assumptions essential to applying the AAIDD definition. Limitations in present functioning must be considered within the context of community environments typical of the individual's age, peers, and culture. And then valid assessment considers cultural and linguistic diversity as well as differences in communication, sensory motor, and behavioral factors. So those are also in that definition. And then within the individual limitations, often it coexists with strengths. Sorry, my dog is starting to snore, so I apologize for that. With appropriate personalized supports over a sustained period, the life functioning of the person with intellectual disability generally will improve. And supports are defined as resources and strategies that aim to promote the development, education, interest, and personal well-being of a person that enhance individual functioning. And especially as these students get older, they need to be aware of those outside agencies, those services they can get outside in their community, because once they leave the educational program, they lose your benefit, your lifelong, you've been with them for 12 years, or actually possibly until they're 21, but then they have to be able to know and be able to go across all the other agencies and ideas in their community. The next one has the different scores and classification of intellectual disabilities. They break it down into 4 different categories or classifications by the degree or level of intellectual impairment as measured by those IQ scores. Again, 2 standard deviations below the mean. The mild is 50 to 55 up to 70. And typically, many times, I've had teachers students with these that are in the mild range that may not even realize that they are in special education. They'll be in their classroom. I've had several, unfortunately, even in the IEP meeting, I've had regular education teachers say, well, I didn't realize this student was even on an IEP. That's not what you want to say. So if you're a regular ed teacher, even though you're trying to make it sound good, it doesn't really sound good when you're supposed to know that they're on an IEP. So don't say that. Moderate is 35 to 40, up to 50 or 55. Severe, 20 to 25 to 35 or 40. And then profound is below 20 or 25 on that IQ score. And kind of typically, those profound, below 20 and 25. In the state of Missouri, we have state-run schools, and many times you will find those students that are in that area, that profound area, in a state school. And you might find some of the severe in that state school also. Identification and assessment. Standardized IQ tests are used to assess intelligence. They're administered by a school psychologist or other trained professional. Many schools nowadays will have a school psychologist that will do all of the IQ testing. That makes it pretty good because then everybody is done by the same person as far as with their IQ testing, which makes it pretty standard across the board for that district. And we've actually also started having those schools that I've been involved with may have them also do the academic testing too. So it gives you a good validity between the 2 tests. But in some districts, you as a special ed teacher, if you're going into special ed, you may be asked to do some of these academic tests on your own and then have somebody else do the IQ test. So important considerations of these IQ tests. IQ is a hypothetical construct. IQ test measures only how a child performs at one point in time on the items included on the test. So that one day, that one kind of a snapshot in time, that's how they performed. If they were having a bad day, if they had the cold, if they had other things going on that they weren't really able to truly focus, that's just how it is on that one day. They can also be culturally biased, depending on the environment the student lives in, or the environment or even the culture that they're around. Some of the terms in those IQ tests might not be what they're looking at. Um, Identification and assessment, a few more. IQ scores can change significantly. Now, I want to add, at least from the perspective that I've been in and the psychological examiner that have been working with, this is kind of typical before middle school age, 5th, 6th grade. They can change. But typically, after the middle school age, in the high school, they will not change typically too much after that point in time. IQ testing is not an exact science. IQ scores should not be used to determine IEP objectives. That should never be done. An IQ score should never be used as a sole basis for making decisions regarding special ed service. Thus, the reason we have a multifaceted, multifactored testing and assessment situation when we're looking at a student with an IEP. So that gets you a little bit of previous information brought into this one. Adaptive behavior is a collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills that have been learned by people in order to function in their everyday lives. The adaptive skills exhibited by a person with ID are critical factors in determining the supports a student requires for success in school, work, community, and home environments. It is very critical if you're looking at ID classification or label, however you want to term it, you need to make sure that you do a good job of including that adaptive behavior testing. Typically, there is a parent and a few teachers that will fill out this behavioral score or scale assessment to determine whether that adaptive behavior would also classify them as a student with ID. So make sure that you have not only the IQ and also the adaptive behavior, also academic scores and some observations are also included. And many times students that are ID will also have speech and language, pathology, SLPs, physical therapists or PT, occupational therapists or OT, and there might be a couple others thrown in there. So assessing that adaptive behavior, conceptual, using language for speaking, reading, writing, and using number concepts. Social, getting along with others, being a responsible group member, solving these social problems, following the rules, and obeying laws and avoiding being victimized. And then the practical skills are also, as we talked a little bit about earlier, daily living skills such as dressing, toiletry, food preparation, etc. And it's all, what I look at in this one are what are age appropriate. You're going to be looking at things that you would typically see in a 4 or 5 year old, or what you would see in a 16, 17-year-old, and then also 18 to 21. What would they be doing? What would they be doing as an adaptive behavior skill? The next slide is one that I'd like for you to pause a little bit and give a couple ideas of what you think the answers are, and then we'll go over that in a few minutes. Number one, why has prevention of mental retardation, or now ID, proven so difficult? And then what are the most important features of effective instruction for students with ID? Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and then go ahead and write down a couple ideas, and then we'll go over those ideas here. Okay, well, first of all, the prevention. Great progress has been made in identifying the cause of ID. Likewise, great advances in preventative medicine have occurred that help identify and treat the high-risk pregnancies. However, for a significant percentage of children diagnosed with ID, there's no known cause can be identified. There, though, have been huge advances in research that still need to be done for further investigation of biomedical causes of ID. In addition, 50% of students identified with ID fall in that mild range. For many of those students, evidence suggests their disabilities can be traced to factors in the environment, such as low levels of social engagement, child abuse, and neglect. Much more needs to be done to provide parents of children at risk for ID for training and support. And with parents as teachers and a lot of the early childhood, which we'll go into later on, there's a lot of things that can be done for students that might be in this ID category. And then what are the most important features of effective instruction? And I'm going to list about 6 features of effective teaching. 1, precise definition and task analysis of the new skill to be learned, so a little bit of breaking down. Direct and frequent measurement of the student's performance. You really need. I know one of the teachers that I was talking to that I've known for years, and she's taught for years. She would come to me sometimes and say, I just don't know that I'm seeing much improvement in these kids. I don't know if I'm getting through to them. And from a person looking from the outside looking in, I could see the definite difference from 1 month to the next. But in her case, since she saw them every day, those little, growth that they were doing in their learning, she didn't necessarily see. So it's something that that's slow, and that's why there's a lot of repetition. That's one of the things. Immediate and systematic feedback. They aren't going to know. If you wait until the end of the day, they're not going to know what they did wrong before. They're not going to remember that. So you need to make sure that you immediately give them that corrective feedback. It's not that you're being mean or whatever, but they need to know and remember, because they won't if you do it by the end of the day or the end of the week. Maybe even by another hour or two later, they won't remember what they've done. Procedures for achieving the transfer of stimulus control from instructional cues or prompts to naturally occurring stimuli, and strategies for promoting the generalization and maintenance of newly learned skills to different non-training situations and environments. There are many times that we hear in an IEP meeting, well, they don't do that at home, or the opposite, they do that at home all the time. A lot of times students in this category, they sometimes can't transfer those skills to another environment. So what they may do at home, they can't do at school. Or what you have them doing at school, they don't do and aren't able to do at home. So you need to practice that. So that's why a lot of times, the families need to be involved in what you're doing and how you're teaching them, because they need to maybe practice that in the home environment and get that assistance. Or maybe the parents have been pretty good at doing things for them. Well, at school, we tend to try to have the students try themselves first, and then if they need assistance, where at home they may do the opposite. It may be just easier for them to do it for them, because of course it takes less time because they're able to do it. So sometimes getting them to understand that situation can sometimes help that. Let me enlarge this a little bit. The characteristics: cognitive functioning and learning and memory is one. The learning rate is another. Attention, the generalization and maintenance we just talked about. Motivation is something you need to look at. You need to be able to know what they like. You need to be able to use things. I had one that really liked trains. Well, if you could have a lesson, if you could have a skill that you could relate to trains and why they need to do that, then you've latched on to that student, and you're able then to help them be more motivated. And anything in red in this category, definitely look over and review. It will be on a quiz, I can assure that of you. Adaptive behavior, self-care and daily living skills we talked about, but it also includes those social relationships, those cues, communication with peers, communication with teachers. Behavior excesses and challenging behaviors. You're going to have those challenging behaviors, and they may not understand. So you're going to have some good social lessons that you can do in classroom. And then positive attributes is also one of the characteristics. Let's talk about the prevalence. During 2012-2013 school year, about 430,000 students ages 3 to 21 were classified in this category of ID. These students represented 6.7% of all school-age children in special education. ID is also the 5th largest category in special education, but the prevalence, it does vary from state to state. So some states may be a little lower, some states may be a little higher. Causes: more than 350 risk factors associated with ID have been identified. 35% of these cases have a genetic cause. Another third of cases involve external trauma or toxin, whereas etiology on the other third, it's unknown. They don't really have an idea of what caused it. And these factors could be prenatal, perinatal, or postnatal factors that may come into play. A little more on the causes. There's biomedical causes. There's Down syndrome and Fragile X syndrome. Now, the prevalence, I don't have any definite data, but for me, the students with Down syndrome or adults with Down syndrome, I have had more students with that classification or biomedical cause than I have the Fragile X syndrome. I've had maybe two or three in the Fragile X, and I can't really say how many in the Down syndrome. Environmental causes, 85 to 90% of people with ID have mild intellectual disability, so fall in that 60 realm, somewhere in there. Most show no evidence of organic pathology, psychosocial disadvantage, or poverty as a factor in that one there. Prevention. Perhaps the single most biggest strike against ID was development of rubella vaccine in 1962. Also, advances in medical science have enabled doctors to identify certain genetic influences that might be the cause. They use some tests, the ultrasonography and maternal serum screening, amniocentesis, chronic villi sampling, genetic counseling, and a mandatory newborn screening test for inherited and biomedical factors are also some that can be considered. Curriculum goals is the next one. Let's look at academic functioning. They do need to have content in the basics of reading, writing, and math. There's a lot of repetition going on with this. A lot of times the students will have a general routine in the morning where they will do some board work that might include checking the weather, might include checking the time, changing the dates on the board, and things like that. And then talking about, if the weather is 40 outside, what does that mean? What can you wear? You probably don't want to wear shorts and a tank top on a day that's 40 degrees. Whereas if it's 70 or 80, you probably don't want to wear the sweaters and long coats and things like that. So these are some things that'll be discussed in class. Kind of relates more to the functional, but right along with that math and reading and writing. Content to increase the student's independence is functional curriculum, self-direction and enjoyment in school, home, community, and work environments, and also self-determination. Content to help a student set goals, plan, and implement a course of action, evaluate their performance, and make adjustments in what they are doing to reach their goals. And this, I think, is one of the key things that you need to understand as a teacher, whether regular ed or special education. Give them choices just like any other student. They need to be able to make those choices. They need to be able to put some ideas on their goals. Maybe not as much when they're in the early elementary and in that kindergarten, first, second, but as they get into, upper third, fourth, fifth, and definitely later on, they need to have some say-so in their goals and give some input in that IEP. Let's see here. Instructional methods. Task analysis, we talked a little bit about that. Breaking down complex or multi-steps into smaller subtasks. A lot of times in the goals for an IEP, these are where you might have those goals that have that breakdown, that have different time. Their main goal may be cooking, but then they have sub-goals down there that talks about, that breaks down that cooking, into what do you need. Looking at the recipe, understanding temperature, understanding how to use the stove, all of those different things, and there's much more that could be put in there, need to be taken into effect. Active student response, a detectable lesson-specific response. That transfer of stimulus control, excuse me, gradually and systematically withdrawing those response prompts. Being able to initially, there might be a lot of prompting from you, the teacher, but as they start to learn the process, taking down the amount of prompting that you put in to let the child do more and more. Again, giving them some of that control back. Direct and frequent measure, objective and frequent recording the performance or behavior so you can have that record keeping. Also, systematic feedback provided by the teacher. Information provided to students about their performance. They need to be praised. There needs to be positive reinforcement put in there to help them, to redirect them to do things that are good versus those things that may not be as acceptable, especially in society with their peers and with others. Instructional feedback, acquisition stage of learning, and practice stage of learning. You need to understand those parts. So look, as you're going through the systematic feedback, make sure you understand that. Sorry if the video moves every once in a while. I'm using my laptop this morning and it's not sitting on a stable surface. Other instructional methods are generalization maintenance, the use of what is learned across settings and over time. We talked about that, and they might learn something in one setting, but then being able to train them and teach them in another setting environment. Strategies: teach the full range of stimulus conditions and response requirements. Make the instructional setting similar to the generalization setting. They talk about contrived common stimulus and community-based instruction. Many times, students and teachers in this section will use those community-like instruction. So making sure you're going through and using some of that community-based instruction as much as possible. Maximize content with naturally occurring contingencies with reinforcement. The placement options. During the 2012-2013 school year, 17% of students with ID were educated in the general classroom. These are going to be probably in the ones in those mild range. 27% were served in resource room programs, where they might have general ed for a little while and then go into the resource room. For some, 49% were served in separate classes. That would be more special ed teachers. This is where you will be working with the students one-on-one. Well, not really one-on-one, but you will have the students in your classroom learning those math, reading, and writing skills. 7% of students with ID are educated in separate schools, residential facilities, or home hospital environments. So not too high of a percentage. In fact, schools, if it's not changed, I think it's about 1% to 4%. They can be placed in that state school environment. Not very, or there's not very high of a percentage in Missouri that goes to that. Normalization, the use of progressively more normal settings and procedures to establish and maintain personal behaviors which are culturally normal as possible. That acceptance in the classroom is critical. One of the things that I want to put out there is if you're a regular education teacher, these students, no matter where they're at, if they're at most of their regular ed out in the special ed classroom, you need to find ways to include them, no matter what the age, so that they feel included in that class just like any of your other students in there. Whether it be you giving some assignments that you're doing in the regular class to the special ed teacher and see if they can integrate that into their teaching. Bringing them in when there are speakers and especially those experiment stages where you're experimenting in class. Bring those students in. They need to be able, a lot of these students will learn a heck of a lot more visually, and especially those peer relationships when they're actually in with a class of your typical regular education students. Social role valorization. People's welfare depends on the social roles they occupy. And self-determination. Special educators can help students with intellectual disabilities identify their goals and provide the instruction and the supports that will enable those pursue those goals. Okay, he decided to get up and move. The next part I want to do before we go is I want to go ahead and go to DESE's website and talk about the standards and indicators. These are what most school districts will utilize to help make sure that these students they are working with meet all the criteria needed to be eligible as a student in the category of intellectual disability or ID. And so hopefully you've gone ahead and clicked that button so you can see what I'm doing. But it's a one page, but look at all what this one page needs in order to put a student who has ID in this category and receive special education. Child performs 2 standard deviations below peers. Name of the cognitive measure used, so name of the test used. Score obtained for the child needs to be included. Statement that the score is equal to or below 2 standard deviations from the mean for that measure, which is valid when considering age, ethnic, and cultural background. Note, the score obtained will vary depending on the instrument. It may be an IQ score, a scaled score, a standard score, percentile, Z-score, or developmental age. Typically, though, a lot of school districts will utilize an IQ score because then it will be something you can judge and compare to their academic scores and their adaptive score, which is next. Adaptive behavior is consistent with those cognitive abilities. Document of adaptive behavior includes the following: the name of adaptive behavior scale administered, the results of that evaluation. So you're going to have 3 or 4 results depending on how many people filled out the measures, the scales, and the overall score on measured adaptive behavior is consistent with those cognitive abilities. So you're going to look at the cognitive score and do those adaptive scores pretty much equal to those cognitive scores. And then there's an and. Some of these as we go through these other ones will be and or. This is an and. Reduced cognitive ability and adaptive behavior adversely affect educational performance. I want to talk about that right now. As we get into some of these other chapters, that will be a common theme, that their disability affects their educational performance, normally in a negative way. So results from formal and informal assessments in achievement in other areas of functioning, such as communication skills and social skill development, indicate the following. First, reduced cognitive abilities and adaptive behavior adversely affect educational performance. And specific areas of impact are described. So not only are you going to tell in the report that their cognitive abilities and adaptive behavior score adversely affect their educational performance, you also have to put down in what areas. So in the areas of math, in the areas of reading, in the areas of writing, in the area of social development or adaptive development, those things that we talked about in this chapter. All of these things will have to be put on that evaluation report. And then typically those scores are summarized then in the IEP in that PLEFT portion of that IEP. So those will also be something to look at. So we've talked about Chapter 4. Let me go through here. Next, and let's go ahead and look at some homework. I'm marking off my list here. I've got one that's kind of out of order here. Let's look at your homework for this chapter. For that, I'm going to go to this screen here. And if you want to go to Blackboard, if you're not, go ahead and go to Blackboard and take a look at that. I've been at this so long where it's logged me out of Blackboard. While that's getting up, I hope that you all this week are starting on your observation assignments. I've already spoken with about 4 of you about the assignment. Make sure and get with me and schedule an appointment to talk over the phone, or if you're near Warrensburg and are on campus, just make an appointment to come see me. The reason being, I understand you're college students and you can read these, but you don't have a chance to go back and redo. If there's something that you're misunderstanding on this assignment, and then you turn in your report in July, and I say, I'm sorry, but you've missed a portion of this and are going to lose points, you can't go back to the classroom and redo this. Most of these observation sites are going to be done at the end of June. That's why right now I still have 2 or 3 students that have not gotten with me on their observations. I'm becoming very worried that they are not going to get these observations in, and there's nothing I can do. If you do not have the observations, you don't have your background check completed, you don't have your observations done, and I have to know where they're at. I have to know the teacher's email and what the teachers teach. Is it regular ed or special ed? Because you do need to do 3 hours in regular ed and 3 hours in special education. So if you're one of those 2 or 3 that haven't gotten all those information to me, do that Monday. I need to know like yesterday, what you're doing. And if you're having troubles, I can try to help you, but it's going to have to be quick. You can't come to me in 2 weeks saying I'm having trouble getting my observations. There's probably not going to be too much I can do at that point. And unfortunately, I don't know how many times I can say this, if you don't do the observation, I cannot pass you in the class. You can get an A on everything else, but if you don't do your observation and turn in that report, I can't do anything with you. I'm going to have to fail you in the course. So do not wait. There's that. I'll get that out of the way. Okay, so now chapter 4. You have the quiz, one discussion board. The interview summary is due Sunday night. And then your differentiated instruction collection. You're going to start doing the ID. So I'm going to go through those real quick. I'm going to go down to assignments and look at the interview. Okay? There's the interview rubric. Okay? The paper should be 2 pages. That does not include a cover page. So if you do a cover page, then it will be 3 pages. The student must have been on an IEP. They can't say, well, they have a disability. They have ADHD. Well, like we just talked about in that standards and indicators, my son had ADHD. But it did not adversely affect his educational performance, so he was never on an IEP. So they have to have an IEP because some of the questions that are on this relate to students that are on an IEP or parents, families that are on an IEP. I recommend that each section have at least a half a page to get full credit on this assignment. There's a description of their disability, description of the impact that their disability had on their family, a description of the modifications and accommodations they received. So again, if you have a student that wasn't on an IEP, they're not going to have modifications and accommodations that they would receive on that IEP. And then the professional reflection items. So let's go to that. There's 15 points for description, and it must include the individual with disability, including relevant information such as age, gender, occupation or year in school, interests or hobbies, and anything else you might gain from talking with that. When it was, then the next part, description of their disability as well as when, how, and by whom their disability was diagnosed. You know, if it was autism, they might have a doctor's diagnosis and medical diagnosis of that autism. Or they might have an educational diagnosis of that autism. You know, ADHD, they're going to have a medical diagnosis. Teachers cannot diagnose the ADHD. They might give information as the doctor and team is looking at the ADHD, but they aren't the ones that are going to diagnose that. A description of the impact on their disability had on their family. And this one here can be tough on this because, you know, many times the students can say, you know, yeah, there was a financial burden, or, you know, siblings didn't like, you know, they felt like the student that had the disability was getting more attention than the other. But more than likely, you're going to also have a lot of pluses. You know, families don't always have negative things that happen to them because of their student has a disability. I think you will find that to be not the case in most of the conversations you've had. Description of the modifications and accommodations that they were made by the individual, family, and teachers so that they can fully participate in the educational process, or FAPE, free appropriate public education. That's going to come from them having some knowledge of their IEP and what did they get to utilize in their classroom. And you may have to dig a little bit in this to help them understand what it is you're talking about. And then the professional reflection. Discussion of how this interview increased your knowledge about serving the needs of students with exceptionalities and how it might have impacted your comfort level regarding having these students in your classroom. My hope is you're going to interview someone that is new, that you wouldn't know, and that way you get a better understanding of another area that will help you when you become a teacher. You know, so I would not recommend doing a brother, a sister, or something like that, because you already have a good knowledge of them. But, you know, a distant cousin, family member that you don't, you know, see that often, that might give you a better perspective, so that when I want this to be a learning experience for you, so that you have a better idea of how to work with these students. And hey, it's no big deal having a student with a disability in your classroom. And then mechanics and overall appearance are also part of this process. And what I would do, and I'm going to explain this multiple times, you will want to download this. It will actually come onto Google. So what you do, when I'd put it right there right now, go ahead and click the button on the interview rubric on Blackboard, and it will open up as a Google Doc. Then go to where it says File in the upper left-hand corner and say Download As, but don't be too quick. Download as a Microsoft Word document. So click that now, download that document. That way it's on your computer, ready to go once you get it started. Once it opens up, I'm going to go ahead and open mine here. Now my computer's going to probably run slow, so it doesn't get there. While it's doing that, then I want you to save it. Once it comes up, I want you to save it. I want you to keep the original title, the UCMO EDSP 2100 interview rubric, but I want you to add in the beginning, I want you to add your first initial, last name. So if I was doing mine, it would be M. Brunkhorst, and then UCMO EDSP 2100 interview rubric 1. Whatever. And then save it as that. The reason being, and you'll see it when I grade these, I grade it on an app on my iPad so that you can see any comments, any notes I made, you can see on that file, just like if I was to print it out and grade it for you and give it to you in class, okay? But to do that, I don't want to have to add a first initial, last name to every one of these documents, because I've had that happen. I've had about 5 or 6 people forget to do that, and then I have 5 or 6 documents that don't say anything as to who it is, who wrote it, or anything, because I'm going to download it on my iPad, and I'm going to grade it, and if I don't have a name, it makes it pretty hard for me to give a grade. So every document you turn in to me, like a paper, anything like that, you're going to put your first initial, last name, and then the rest of the title, like mine just came up. So again, instead of UCMO EDSP 2100 interview rubric, yours is going to say your first initial, your last name, then UCMO EDSP 2100 interview rubric. And you're going to save it. Now you've got that document on your computer, and then here's the next part. You don't need to write another paper or whatever. I'm going to go ahead and enlarge mine so I can see it. I want you to go to the bottom of that rubric. My computer, my laptop is in front of it. And just hit return until you get that new page. Then you're going to change that Times New Roman to a 12-point font. And then if you want to put a cover page in, put your cover page right here. Go down to the next page, and then start typing your interview summary right on this page. That way, when I download it onto my computer and then use my iPad, I'm going to have your rubric right with your page so that I can go ahead, and as I'm going through and reading your paper, I can go up here. Okay, they did. They went through the disability, including the age, the gender, the occupation in school, interests, hobbies, whatever. I can see that. Okay, they got all 15 points. I'll write that on there, right on your paper. Then I'll go down to the next one, and the next, and the next. And when I get done, I'll have your total score. I'll then put a typed response of some ideas, just some sort of critiquing of the paper. I'll save it. And then when I do my grading on Blackboard, I will upload this attachment, a PDF attachment that will have all of my notes, your rubric, your paper, all in one nice deal. So remember, when you're doing the scoring rubric for the interview, you're going to download the document. You're going to use that document for your paper. You're not going to delete the scoring rubric. You're going to go down to the bottom of the page of the scoring rubric and return a couple times till you get a new page. If you want to put a cover page in, there's your cover page. If you don't, just start typing. Just start answering those questions from the top down. Okay? Then when you get done, you're going to save it as your first name initial, your last name, and then UCMO EDSP 2100 interview rubric 1-1, whatever it is, okay? And save it, and then you're going to upload that document to Blackboard just like it is. And then I'm going to download it. I'll have the rubric on the paper and the paper. So remember, I will take off points if you do not follow directions. I will take off points, and at 75 points, you need to get all the points you need. Okay? So if you have questions, email me. Make a schedule to go ahead and talk to me about it. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and look at the DI collection. This is actually, I've had a lot of positive talks about this DI collection. If you go to that, there is a video, but remember, this video was done a couple years back. It's still very relevant, but we are only using Pinterest. So do not use Evernote, do not use OneNote. We're only using Pinterest. And for you guys out there that don't know Pinterest, you ladies probably have 20 million Pinterest pins on your Pinterest. I didn't know what the heck it was. My wife was using it. Now I wish my wife didn't use it because I have so many things on my to-do list from her looking at Pinterest. I won't get done until I'm in my 90s at this point. Seriously, guys. So anyway, what you're going to do on the DI collection is you're going to go in each week from now on. And this week we're in ID. So you're going to go and you're going to look at differentiated instruction for students with ID. And you're going to find 5 to 6 items on Pinterest that you would like to do in your classroom, that you think are interesting to do if you're in your classroom. So if you're teaching English, go ahead and look up differentiated instruction in the area of English for students with ID. You look it up, and I kid you not, you will have tons of information. So it really doesn't take long, but for some of you that aren't Pinterest users, it may take a little longer to get an idea of what's going on. So let me read this a little bit. It's meant to give you resources to add to your toolbox. I want these to be things that you can use. So you can start adding resources for differentiated instruction now. Students will develop a collection of resources related to differentiated instruction, including websites, sample lesson plans, explanations of DI strategies, etc. The students will collect these resources each week, at least 6 per week. So this week, you're only looking at students with ID, and you're going to go on to Pinterest, you're going to do some searching, and you're going to find 6 that go with the idea of ID and differentiated instruction. You will need to have at least 25 resources in your toolbox or in your Pinterest by the end of the 11th week. The collection will be worth 75 points, and this assignment is due the Friday before the last week. That way I can look at it, make sure that everything is done. You're going to use Pinterest. You will need to put them in categories on your Pinterest board. During the last half of the semester, you will be asked to start this project. Well, actually, in a summer course, you're asking to this week. And should at least 6 articles or 6 posts each week on the subjects. Not on Blackboard. This is going to be on the Pinterest site. Then during the last week of classes, not the finals week, you will make your top 10 list. You will summarize your top 10 items that you have collected on DI and write them. And I have a template. It should be easy for you to figure this out. You will need to include for each item its name, what it is. If it was, yes, it's on Pinterest. Yes, it's on that. But is it from a website originally? Is it a sample lesson plan? And then explanations of DI strategies. Include a paragraph summary, at least 150 words of why it's on your top 10 list and what you intend to use it for. Then include in your paper a link or share the technology. So what you all will do in this one is you're actually going to share your Pinterest board. You don't need to share all your Pinterest. You can just share with me your DI collection board from your Pinterest. And I put mine on the page. MC Brunk is my title or my little username, I guess, for what you can say. And you can email me if you're having trouble with that. But I tell you right up here, my username is MC Brunk. After class, you can unshare me, or actually, I'm probably going to unshare you. I don't really use Pinterest that much, but I will normally unshare you once we get done. But I do need to be able to see that you have put your Pinterest board in the categories that I asked for in the rubric. Okay, so I'm going to go down. There is the DI collection explanation video that you can look at. But again, we're not using Evernote. We're not using OneNote. It's just Pinterest. So I'm going to click the DI collection rubric just to make sure you understand this part of it. You will need to have the categories of websites, lesson plans, and explanations. And each one of those needs to have at least 5 in the category. So you need to at least have, by the time you do this assignment, 5 that are websites. You need to at least have 5 that are lesson plans. And most of you are going to have no trouble with this. And then 5 that are explanations of DI strategies. Now, I say etc. because you will probably want to add some of your own columns or your own categories as you go through this. So again, I want you to be able to use this. I don't want this to be an assignment that you're just doing for me. I want you to be able to utilize it and then be able to understand how big of a deal Pinterest can be to help you. So again, you need to categorize your Pinterest, and I do that to start out with. So, you know, if you don't know, I Google it. It's a lot better than trying to get with me, but I can't. I would Google it. How do you categorize or make groups in Pinterest on a board? And then each of your categories, again, should have 5 items. Many of you would easily have more. Make sure you share it with me, the MC Brunk. Make sure you save the document as your first initial last name. So like this one here is DI Collection Rubric. So when you save it on your computer, you're going to go ahead and save it as your first initial last name. So mine would be M. Brunkhorst DI Collection Rubric 18. Again, to make sure you realize what this is, I would go ahead and download it to your computer from Google. Do not do it on a Google document. It needs to be on a Word document. So I would click File, and then download as Microsoft Word. Then it's going to come to your computer as a Word document. Then I would immediately share it with your first initial last name and then differentiate, you know, the DI collection rubric. And then you've got it on your paper. Now, the rubric's there. So I'm going to look. Does the collection include all areas of required information? That's 5 times 4. That's 20 points right there. Does each section include name, what it is, a summary of why it's on your top 10, 150 words? I'm going to put that in here. That's 10 points times 5. That's 50 points. And then there's 5 points for mechanics and organization. So let's scroll down. You'll see that I already have a template ready for you. My top 10 list of differentiated instruction. You're going to put the name of the item. So just highlight name of the item and you're going to put the name of the item. Then you're going to leave. Is it a website, lesson plan, or explanation, or is it your own category? So take off what it isn't, leave what is in parentheses. Then the web page, if it's a web page, most of you are going to have Pinterest, and then you're going to go ahead and put down that the next part is explanation as to why you chose this section as part of your top 10. You're going to have all of that in here. And you're going to do that for 10 items. And then you're going to go ahead and turn that in. Again, first and initial, last name, and go ahead and turn it in. And this turn in will not be till the end of the semester, but I wanted you to understand what's involved. And I'll also go through it about 3 weeks from the end so that we can review this and make sure. This one here is single space, 12-point font, a little different than some of the other ones. Okay, so that gets you the different assignments. You'll also have the quiz and the discussion board. That's all for this one. Next week we'll be going over Chapter 5. It's also just a 1-chapter week. I did these 2 weeks here because I knew that most of you should be doing your observations this week and next week and finishing those observations up. So I gave you a little bit less these couple weeks. But please, get with me on questions again on the observations. If you don't have your background check to me, if you don't have your observation sites to me, you're late. You need to get those in now. I cannot say it enough. You're probably not going to like me because I'm going to probably email you maybe twice a day. I need this now to know where you're at so that you're not sitting there. You can't procrastinate on this part, guys. Really can't. So anyway, I'll see you later. Sorry this was a little longer, but I wanted to explain a couple of the assignments, make sure you knew where you were going. So anyway, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.